Well, hello! Welcome to my YouTube channel where we talk about all things sheep and wool. Today we're discussing felt. What is felt? And how do you turn this into this? Let's talk about it. The simplest way to describe felt is it's just simply fibers that have become entangled with each other. When that happens, you can turn it into fabric. You can cut it, you can sew it, you can shape it, you can sculpt it, you can do whatever. It's an amazing process. I have a farmer's market booth and I sell lots of felt art through there. And all the time I get people asking me, what is felt? How do you do this? I'm shocked that it's 2025 and people still don't know what felt is. But there you go. Felt is just simply fibers that have become entangled. There's a couple different ways to accomplish this. There is needle felting and there's wet felting, which I do mostly wet felting. And the reason why is because needle felting is a sit-down activity. And as you can see, I'm not very good at sitting down. Also, you stab yourself a lot. Every time I needle felt, I stab my fingers a lot and there's a lot of swear words that are said. But there are some amazing needle felting artists out there. So let's talk about it. So how do you felt with a needle? This is a specific felting needle. I don't know if you can see it, but on the shaft of the needle, there are these little barbs and they're angled down so that when you stab the fibers, it picks up those fibers and pushes it through to become entangled with the other fibers. However, wet felting, that's magic. So when people ask me, how do you do this? Instead of trying to explain in 1,000 words what felt is and how to make it happen, I just tell them it's magic, because to me, it is magic. Simply water, soap, and agitation. That's how you get felt. But there's an awful lot of nuances to that I wish I had known before I started my journey. So this video is teaching you all about the basics of wet felting and all the things that I wish someone had told me before I started. So let's go. So let's start with the very basics of felt, which is the fiber. So all fibers have scales, whether it's hair or it's wool or it's silk or it's something else. All fibers have scales. It's just the structure of the fiber. The reason why wool felts and other fibers don't is because those scales kind of stick out a little bit. They're kind of like barbs. If you think about a fish hook or a felting needle, they have these little barbs. And the barbs make it so that when the fibers become entangled with each other, they can't be pulled apart because they're held together with those barbs. So things like mohair, silk, other types of fibers just don't have those scales that stick out like wool does. So wool is the perfect fiber for felting. And the basics of wool fiber is actually micron. So if you're interested in doing some felting and you go online to go buy some wool, some roving or whatever, you'll notice that there's always a listing for the micron. The micron is just simply the diameter of the fibers. So if you have something like a fine wool breed, like a merino or something along those lines, those fibers are going to be smaller in diameter than other breeds of sheep like long wool. So think of like Icelandic or Gotland or Teeswater, Wensleydale, whatever. Those fibers are much bigger around than those smaller micron fibers such as a merino. This is really important to know because it's going to tell you how your project is going to felt and what the end use of that product is. If you use a fine micron, small micron, fine wool breed on something, say like slippers or something else like that has a hard wear to it, that's going to affect how long that project lasts. So microns, very important to know. So now we have an understanding about micron. Let's talk about the things that make fibers felt. There's three main things, and that is water, soap, and agitation. You can felt stuff just with agitation. It'll take forever, but you can do it. But the other two, water and soap, are also really important. And I'll tell you the reason why. The soap is what makes the fiber slippery, and it makes it easier for those fibers to slide along each other and to become entangled. The temperature of the water is also really important because heat makes those scales on the fiber open up even more. So if you are felting with cool water, the cool water keeps those scales close to the fiber shaft, and so it's going to take longer to felt. There are many instances where this is preferred. You want it to take longer to felt. For instance, Nuno felting, which is where you felt wool onto silk. You want it to take a long time because you want those fibers to migrate through the silk in order to felt. So if you apply hot water, then it makes those fibers felt really quick and they don't get a chance to get through the fabric. So if you are felting something and you want it to felt really quick, use hot water. It's great. It works awesome. That's actually the majority of what I do is with hot water. The other thing to talk about is soap. I see this question all the time. What kind of soap should I use? And the short answer is it really doesn't matter. It just comes down to your personal preference. I like Dawn dish soap mainly because I felt a lot of things in the raw, meaning that the wool is not washed or cleaned ahead of time. And so that hot water helps the lanolin release from the fibers. But also, I like it to felt quick. I don't do a lot of Nuno felting. I do all kinds of other felting, but I want the rolling and the agitation to be minimalized as much as possible because that's actually the hardest part of felting, really. So the soap makes the fibers slippery. The temperature of the water dictates how fast they felt. And then, of course, the agitation is the most important part. There's lots of ways to agitate to make those fibers integrate with each other. There's rolling, there's washing machines, there's all kinds of things. Personally, I don't like to use a washing machine because I like to use my hands because I can tell just with my hands where that project is in the felting process. If it's felting quicker or slower or whatever, I can tell by my hands. And I'm also kind of a control freak. I wouldn't want to put a project in a bag and pop it in the washing machine because I have no idea what's going on in there. I could pull it out and it would just be a big giant felted ball. That's not my preference. And if you're just starting out, I strongly recommend doing things the hard way because that's how you learn. I'm going to help you along this process, and I'm going to tell you all the things that I've learned through that process, but you still have to learn and you still have to understand the basics of felting. All right, so now let's talk about staple length. Staple length just refers to the length of the individual fibers. This is something that's super important to know because this is what determines what your end product will be. If you have short stapled fibers, your project, those fibers are going to shorten and they're going to pull up a little bit and you're going to get pilling. This also happens if you use a fine wool such as a merino on something that has a harder wear like slippers or bath mat or something like that. Because those fibers are so fine, they'll also pull up and pill. So you want a long stapled fiber. This will also make your felting that much easier. Trust me on this. All right, now that we've talked about micron and fiber length or staple length, let's talk about percent of shrinkage. This is important for your project. And your percentage of shrinkage is going to depend on which fiber you're using. If you're using a finer micron, you're going to have a higher percentage of shrinkage because those fibers can compact more and become tighter. Whereas if you have like a longer wool, a BFL or Gotland or something like that with a higher micron and with a longer staple length, you're going to have a smaller percentage of shrinkage. So for instance, Merino usually has about a 50% shrinkage rate versus BFL or Gotland, which normally have about a 30% shrinkage rate. This is really important because it's going to dictate the size of the pattern that you're using. So, for instance, if you want to make slippers and you're using a fine merino wool, which I highly recommend you not do, it will make a nice, tight, compact felt, but it won't wear very well, it will pill, and you will have huge shrinkage. So you're going to have to double the size of your pattern to get the amount, the end size that you want, because there's just that much shrinkage. So if I felt something with Gotland, I always know I need to add at least 30%. Sometimes it's 40%. Like if I'm using Gotland lamb, it's going to be closer to 40%, again, because that micron is smaller than an adult. So percentage of shrinkage, super important to know. So in that same vein of percentage of shrinkage, let's also talk about which direction the fibers felt. I so badly wish that somebody would have told me this. It would have saved me hours and hours of headache. So, which direction do your fibers shrink? Do they shrink this way or do they shrink this way? The answer is they shrink this way. There will be some shrinkage this way because the fibers are going to get closer together. But the majority of the shrinkage is going to happen in that long aspect because they shrink up. So, important to know when it comes to layering, which direction you want to lay your fibers is going to dictate which direction you want your felt to shrink. So, if you have, let's say, a handbag and you want the top of it to be narrower than the bottom, of course you're going to start with your pattern or whatever, your resist. But it's also going to matter which direction you lay your fibers. If you want them to shrink more towards the top, then you're going to want the fibers to be going this direction. Whereas if you want it to shrink up and down, you're going to want to lay your fibers in this direction. And there you go. All right, so that leads right into the next aspect, which is layering. There's always this question, how many layers should I have? How thick should my layers be? Well, there's a lot of variables in there, such as what your intended end use is for your project, what breed of sheep you're using, and what the micron is. So let's say I'm using Gotland. Then I know, because those are thicker, it's a higher micron, that I don't need as many layers if I'm using something like merino. So now here's the next thing. So which direction do you lay your fibers? Do you lay it in a crosshatch pattern? Do you do a herringbone pattern? Or what kind of pattern? Well, that depends. It's up to you. Which direction you want your project to shrink, and how thick you want it to be. Is it something that you need more structure, say like a vessel, a handbag, slippers, or something that's going to have a harder wear? Then you're going to want a thicker felt and therefore more layers. Whereas if you want something that is thinner, has a little bit more drape to it, then you're going to want less layers. So it all depends on what your end use is for that particular product. All right, so let's talk about the most important aspect of felting, which is agitation. Agitation, of course, is the most important thing about felting because that's how you force the fibers to become integrated with each other. So, what do you use for agitation besides a washing machine or whatever? If you look at videos or tutorials, you'll see that everybody uses bubble wrap. Why? Why bubble wrap? Well, because it has an uneven surface and that encourages the fibers to become integrated. Now, you can use regular bubble wrap, but I will warn you that it won't last very long. the soap degrades the plastic and it makes the bubbles pop, and therefore it doesn't last very long. So this is actually a pool cover. You can go to any pool, spa, supply center, whatever, and you can buy a big roll of this stuff for actually pretty cheap, like $20. And you can cut it up and use it for years. I still have my original piece of pool cover that's 10 years old now, and it is still going strong. Yes, some of those bubbles have popped, but it still works really great. You can also, because it's in a big roll, you can cut out sections and you can use them as resist material. I like to use bubble wrap for resist because then it's agitating from the outside and the inside, and I just like it. So besides bubble wrap, there's other things. This is actually, I didn't realize how dirty it was until I brought it out for this video. But this is something that I picked up at a garage sale or thrift store or something like that. And it's like a back massager, but this thing works awesome. It has a little handle so it won't slide out of my grasp with all the soap and such. And it just agitates the surface very well. I also use a rolling pin. I didn't bring it with me, but I like to use a rolling pin for the initial stages of felting to get all those fibers to sit down with each other and to start that felting process. And I also have this. This is one of my favorite pieces of, I don't know, equipment that I use. It's a darning egg. And I like it because this helps me with anything that has a curved section on it, because it can felt over it and it just works better than, say, my knuckles or my fingers. So there are lots of different tools that you can use to help with the agitation process, but the bubble wrap is by far the most important. And lastly, the last thing I wish I would have known when I started on my felting journey is rest. Sometimes those projects, if you are agitating and you're working it and you're working it and you're working it and it's just not felting, it's not coming together the way you want to come together, just leave it alone. Leave it overnight. You can rinse it or not. I usually don't. I just leave it out on my work table or on the counter or whatever and just let it rest overnight. You'll find that if you let it rest overnight and come back to it again in the morning and you refresh the water and the soap, that thing will felt beautifully exactly the way you wanted it to on the first try. So I'm not even quite sure what happens in that process, if the soap just makes those scales stand up more or what, but let it rest overnight and come back the next day. So there you have it. All the tips and the basic understanding of fibers that I wish I had known when I started on my felting journey. If you got any kind of value out of this video, or you just simply want to see me do other crazy things, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Also visit my playlist section. I have lots of videos on there that is everything sheep and wool, including hide tanning, which is my second love. Okay, bye!